In this sense, the International made Marx practice a form of politics more patient than his polemical writing sometimes suggested. The debates over strikes showed how theory and practice met. Some mutualists doubted the value of strikes, seeing them as temporary conflicts that did not transform the deeper system of exchange. British trade unionists knew strikes as necessary instruments of workplace power. Marx supported strikes not because he thought they abolished capitalism, but because they trained workers in collective action and resisted the tendency of capital to press wages and hours in its own favor. A strike, for him, could be limited in immediate result, and still important in historical education. It taught workers that their condition was shared and that employers could be opposed collectively. The struggle over the working day remained central. Marx had devoted important sections of Capital to the legal and social battle over hours, and the International continued to treat time as a political issue. How long a person worked was not a private arrangement between equal individuals if one side owned the means of livelihood and the other needed wages to survive. The demand for shorter hours carried more than physical relief. It claimed that a worker's life contained time not owned by capital. The simplicity of the demand made its meaning travel. Across the late 1860s, the International grew in influence, though not always in direct strength. Governments watched it with suspicion, and newspapers often exaggerated its unity and power. This exaggeration sometimes helped the association appear larger than it was, but it also made it an object of fear. The image of a secret central body directing unrest across Europe was misleading. The International was active, but it was also argumentative, underfunded, uneven, and dependent on local conditions. Its real power lay less in command than in connection. It gave scattered struggles a sense that they belonged to something wider. The Paris Commune in 1871 changed everything around it. After France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War and the collapse of Napoleon III's Second Empire, Paris entered a crisis of siege, hunger, republican hope, and distrust of the national government. In March 1871, the city's National Guard and radical municipal forces resisted attempts by the government at Versailles to remove cannon from Paris. A commune was proclaimed, and for a brief period the city governed itself through elected bodies, worker measures, anti-clerical reforms, and the intense improvisation of revolutionary municipal life. The event was short, but its effect on socialist memory was immense. Marx did not plan the commune, and he was cautious before it began. He understood that Paris was isolated and that the balance of force was dangerous. Once the commune existed, however, he defended it as a historic experiment in working-class government. The Civil War in France, written for the International, became his great public statement on the event. He praised the commune not as a perfect model, but as a living attempt to break with the bureaucratic and military machinery of the old state. The text gave the commune an interpretation that helped preserve it after its physical defeat. The defeat was severe, and the chronicle need not dwell on its violence to recognize its scale. During the final week in May 1871, Versailles forces retook Paris, the commune fell, and thousands of communards were killed, imprisoned, or deported. The consequences reached far beyond France. Conservative governments treated the commune as proof of the danger represented by socialism and the International. Radicals treated it as martyrdom, experiment, and warning. Marx's defense made his name more widely known and also more feared. The International, already watched, now seemed to many authorities like the hidden author of revolution, even where its actual control had been limited. Unity among radicals became harder after the commune. The old disagreements over political action, central authority, and the state sharpened under the pressure of defeat. Mikhail Bakunin emerged as Marx's greatest rival inside the broader revolutionary movement. Bakunin was a Russian aristocrat turned anarchist revolutionary, a man of enormous personal force, suspicion of authority, and belief in spontaneous revolt against state and hierarchy. He had his own network, especially in parts of Switzerland, Italy, and Spain, and he distrusted Marx's emphasis on political organization and the conquest of political power by the working class. The conflict between Marx and Bakunin was not merely a quarrel of personalities, though personality mattered very much. Marx saw Bakunin as conspiratorial, undisciplined, and theoretically confused. Bakunin saw Marx as authoritarian, overly German, and inclined toward central control. Behind the insults lay a real strategic division. Should workers organize politically, form parties, contest state power, and use collective institutions to transform society? Or should revolution seek to abolish the state directly through federations of communes, associations, and insurgent energy from below? The argument would echo through later socialist and anarchist movements long after both men were gone. Marx believed that the working class had to organize as a class and enter political struggle. He did not imagine the existing state could simply be taken over unchanged, especially after his reflections on the Paris Commune. But he remained convinced that political power could not be ignored. Bakunin feared that any path through political power would produce a new domination, with intellectuals and party leaders ruling in the name of workers. This fear was not trivial. The history that came later would give readers many reasons to return to it. In Marx's own time, however, the disagreement was fought through congresses, documents, personal charges, and organizational maneuver. The Hague Congress of 1872 marked the decisive break. Marx and his allies secured resolutions affirming the importance of political action and moved the General Council to New York, a decision that effectively removed the international center from the immediate European battlefield. Bakunin was expelled, along with James Guillaume, after accusations involving secret organization and conduct. The formal victory belonged to Marx's side, but the association itself was weakened by the struggle. A movement can win an internal fight and still lose much of the common space that made the fight worth having. Movements fracture over methods as much as goals. Many radicals wanted emancipation, equality, and the end of exploitation. But they disagreed over the road, the organization, the use of authority, and the danger of replacing one ruling structure with another. The International had briefly gathered a wide family of labor and socialist currents. The Commune gave that family a heroic and tragic center, but it also intensified every dispute over what revolution meant. After The Hague, the First International declined, and its remaining life in New York lacked the force it had carried in Europe. For Marx, the years of the International brought public recognition and exhaustion. He had drafted, argued, defended, organized, and fought rivals, all while his health remained uncertain and his economic work unfinished. Capital had given him intellectual authority, but the International gave him a different reputation, that of a dangerous organizer whose pen might stand behind worker unrest across borders. The reputation exaggerated his command, but not his influence. He had become one of the central figures through whom the labor movement interpreted itself. The decline of the International did not end Marx's political importance, but it changed the form of his later life. The great public organizational struggle receded. His health, Jenny's health, family concerns, and unfinished manuscripts pressed more heavily. Socialist parties and workers' movements would continue to develop, especially in Germany, but Marx himself would not build another organization on the scale of the International. The remaining years would be quieter in public appearance and no less restless in thought. After the meetings, congresses, addresses, and quarrels, the desk remained. Marx still had manuscripts to complete, notebooks to arrange, letters to answer, and questions that had widened rather than narrowed with age. The Commune had altered his understanding of the state, and the conflict with Bakunin had exposed the future fractures of revolutionary politics. Yet much of his life's work still lay unfinished, waiting in drafts that only Engels would later have the strength and patience to gather. The story now moves toward those final years, where the public figure becomes again a man among papers, illness, family loss, and the long afterlife of work he did not live to complete. Chapter 13. The work left on the desk. Marx did not leave behind a completed system arranged neatly for the world to inherit. He left books, published arguments, scattered articles, letters, drafts, excerpts, mathematical exercises, notebooks on anthropology, notes on Russia, studies of agriculture, fragments on capital, and a vast unfinished labor that had outrun the health and time of the man who carried it. The image of Marx after death often becomes too solid, as though the beard, the grave, the slogans, and the later movements had always been waiting for him. The living Marx was less finished than that. He remained, even near the end, a man surrounded by papers that still asked more from him. His later years were not idle, though they were increasingly limited by illness. After Capital Volume 1 appeared in 1867, Marx continued working on the material that would become later volumes, but the work resisted closure. The second and third volumes required arrangement of material on circulation, profit, reproduction, credit, rent, and the total movement of capitalist production. These were not minor appendices to the first book. They belonged to the larger architecture he had imagined for decades. Yet illness, political labor, family matters, and his own habit of expanding every question made completion difficult. The great book remained both an achievement and an unfinished house. This incompletion is one of the most important facts about Marx's intellectual life. It prevents the story from becoming too smooth. He was not a man who calmly produced a doctrine and then watched it travel. He was a man who kept revising, reading, doubting details, adding evidence, and following new problems into new fields. The late notebooks show a mind still alert to societies that did not fit the simplest European sequence. Russia, communal landholding, non-Western histories, ancient societies, and anthropology all drew his attention. The older Marx did not merely repeat the younger Marx's formulas. He continued to ask whether history moved in more than one pattern. The Russian question especially mattered. Some Russian radicals looked to Marx for guidance, and the peasant commune, or Mir, raised a problem for any simple account of development. Could Russia pass through capitalist dissolution in the same way as Western Europe? Or might communal forms become part of a different path if joined to a broader social transformation? Marx treated the question carefully, especially in drafts of his letter to Vera Zasulich in 1881. He did not offer a careless prophecy. He examined the historical conditions around the commune and considered whether Russia's future had to repeat England's past. This caution is worth noticing because later readers often made Marx more rigid than he always was. Mathematics also occupied him in these years. He filled notebooks with calculus, algebra, and reflections on mathematical method, not because he had suddenly abandoned political economy, but because he remained drawn to forms of rigorous analysis. A man associated so heavily with factories, class struggle, and revolution spent late hours working through derivatives and symbolic relations. The detail is small, but it restores the odd breadth of his mind. Marx was difficult to place within any single category: philosopher, journalist, economist, revolutionary, historian, polemicist, exile, and student even in age. His health, however, narrowed the world around him. Liver troubles, bronchial illness, pleurisy, headaches, and painful skin conditions had long interrupted his work. Later in life, these ailments became harder to overcome. Doctors urged travel for health, and Marx spent time away from London in places thought to offer better air or climate. He went to the Isle of Wight, to health resorts, to Algiers, to the south of France, and other places where recovery might be possible. These journeys were not leisurely departures from work. They were attempts to keep a failing body in motion long enough for the mind to continue. Jenny Marx's health also declined. She had carried decades of exile, poverty, household strain, copying, worry, and political companionship. In 1881, she died after illness, leaving Marx bereaved in a way that cannot be separated from the whole arc of his adult life. She had known him before the world knew him, and she had endured the cost of the work before the work had any secure place in history. The marriage had not been easy, and no honest account needs to smooth it into a sentimental portrait. Yet her death removed one of the oldest continuities in his life, the person who had walked with him from Trier's youthful hopes into the long exile of London. Marx was too ill to attend Jenny's funeral. This fact has a plain sadness because it joins private grief to bodily limitation without requiring embellishment. A man who had written about world history, revolution, and the movement of capital could not perform one of the simplest public acts of mourning. Engels, who understood the depth of the loss, wrote that Marx had died too, in a sense, with Jenny's death, though Marx would live a little longer. The remark was intimate rather than theoretical. It recognized how much of Marx's life had been held together by a bond that had survived nearly everything else. Eleanor Marx, Laura Lafargue, and the family circle remained important in the final years. Eleanor especially stayed close to her father, helping him, reading with him, and later becoming one of the most active carriers of his memory and politics. The daughters had grown up inside a household where affection, argument, illness, debt, literature, and revolution had never been separate. Their adult lives showed how deeply that world had marked them. They were not merely witnesses to Marx's legacy, they were part of the human continuation of it. The public socialist movement was also changing. In Germany, figures such as Wilhelm Liebknecht and August Bebel helped build a workers' party that would become increasingly important despite repression under Bismarck's anti-socialist laws. Marx followed these developments with interest and sometimes impatience. He criticized formulations he found confused, including in the Gotha program of 1875, where he objected to phrases about labor, distribution, and the state. Even in declining health, he remained unwilling to let friendly movements pass uncorrected when he thought their principles were loose. Agreement never freed anyone from Marx's criticism. Legacy had already begun to escape the author. Marx could influence parties, correspond with radicals, and comment on programs, but he could not control how his thought would be simplified, translated, adapted, or hardened by movements that needed slogans as much as analysis. The process had begun before his death. The manifesto traveled more easily than capital. Political phrases traveled more easily than methodological cautions. Workers' parties needed platforms, not endless notebooks. Admirers and opponents alike began turning Marx into something more definite than the unfinished scholar actually was. After Jenny's death, Marx's own strength faded further. In early 1883, the death of his eldest daughter, Jenny Longuet, added another blow. The accumulation of grief and illness left him weakened beyond recovery. On the 14th of March, 1883, in London, Marx died in his armchair. The manner of death was quiet, almost startlingly small beside the later size of his reputation. There was no crowd, no public drama, no final command to history. The life that had moved through Trier, Bonn, Berlin, Cologne, Paris, Brussels, London, newspapers, trials, libraries, councils, and manuscripts, ended in a room. Highgate Cemetery received him in a modest burial. Only a small group stood at the graveside, among them Engels, family members, and close comrades. Engels spoke there, not to a mass movement gathered in thousands, but to the few who had come to bury a friend. He described Marx as a thinker who had discovered the law of development of human history and the special law of motion of capitalist production. He also named Marx's revolutionary work, his role in the International, and his lifelong commitment to the working class. The speech was brief, but it helped shape how Marx would be remembered. Engels' words mattered because he was not only praising the dead, he was beginning the work of preservation. He knew better than anyone how much remained unfinished, and he understood the papers Marx had left behind as both treasure and burden. To bury Marx was one task. To rescue Marx's manuscripts from disorder was another, and it would consume much of Engels' remaining life. The friend who had sent money, advice, drafts, jokes, and political judgment would now become editor, interpreter, defender, and guardian. Capital Volumes 2 and 3 were published after Marx's death through Engels's labor. Volume 2 appeared in 1885 and Volume 3 in 1894. Engels had to work through drafts that were often incomplete, uneven, and difficult to arrange. He did not simply print a finished manuscript left in a drawer. He reconstructed, ordered, clarified, and sometimes made editorial decisions under conditions that later scholars would examine closely. The published Marx after 1883 was therefore, in part, Marx through Engels. This does not make the work false. It makes its survival historical, dependent on friendship, judgment, and patient editorial labor. The world did not receive Marx in one way. Some workers' movements treated him as a guide to class struggle and capitalist crisis. Some economists dismissed or attacked him. Some political leaders used parts of his thought while ignoring others. Some philosophers returned to the early writings. Some organizers preferred the sharper phrases of the manifesto. Some scholars gave their lives to the dense arguments of capital. Already the name Marx had begun to divide rooms. It would continue doing so, long after the man himself could no longer revise a sentence. The 20th century would carry his name into revolutions, states, parties, arguments, tragedies, hopes, and crimes far beyond the scope of his own 19th century life. That later history is vast, and it cannot be folded back into the man too simply. Marx did not govern the states that later claimed him. He did not write every slogan spoken in his name. He did not foresee every use of his work, and no author controls the fate of an idea once it passes into institutions, armies, schools, parties, prisons, parliaments, and classrooms. The afterlife of Marx belongs to history, but it should not erase the life before it. That life was made of movement. Trier gave him law, family, and the first evidence that public power could enter private identity. Bonn gave him disorder. Berlin gave him philosophy. Cologne gave him censorship and property disputes. Paris gave him socialism, Jenny's first exile household, and Engels. Brussels gave him the turn toward history. The revolutions gave him hope and defeat. London gave him poverty, the British Museum, the International, Capitol, and the long unfinished desk. No single city explains him. Together they made the path through which his thought gathered force. Near the end, the papers mattered most. Not because they were more important than the people around him, but because they were what remained to be carried. Notebooks lay with excerpts, calculations, drafts, and plans. Letters preserved arguments and anxieties that spoken conversation had already lost. Published books stood beside unfinished manuscripts, and the unfinished ones kept asking for order. Engels, Eleanor, and others would take up that work in different ways, but the room itself had already changed. The hand that had written, crossed out, delayed, expanded, and returned to the same problems for decades was still. The fade begins there, not with a monument, but with paper. A sheet covered in Marx's hand, a notebook open to a passage copied from an economist or a report, a margin holding a mark that once meant return to this, examine this again, do not leave this settled. The world outside the desk had already begun to move his name into arguments he would never hear. Inside the papers, the older labor remained slower. Ink held the pressure of thought without needing to announce it. Highgate held the body, and the manuscripts held the unfinished work. Between them stood Engels, family, comrades, editors, translators, printers, and readers, each carrying a little of what one life had left unresolved. The grave did not close the matter, it only marked the place where the man stopped, and the handling of the work continued. In libraries, copies of Capital settled onto shelves. In workers' rooms and party offices, pamphlets passed from hand to hand. In private studies, readers paused over sentences that seemed to resist them before yielding a little. Marx had spent much of his life studying the hidden relations inside ordinary things. A coat, a coin, a wage, a working day, a factory report, a printed page. After his death, his own papers became ordinary things of that kind. They could be stacked, sorted, mailed, edited, bound, misplaced, recovered, translated, and read under different lamps by people he would never know. Their survival depended on material acts as humble as the world he had tried to explain. So the story rests not in certainty, but in remains. A grave in London, a shelf of books, a bundle of manuscripts once left unfinished, paper touched by hands, darkened by ink, carrying arguments that began in the 19th century and did not stay there. The life had ended, but the pages remained, and for a while longer, in the stillness of archives and reading rooms, the work kept its quiet weight. The journey is complete. Rest well.